Florida FAR/BAR residential as-is contract for sale and purchase. First, we have, of course, the parties, the sellers, and the buyer or buyers. The property description, which is going to include the proper address, the county that it is located in, the property tax ID number that you'll find in the tax records, as well as the legal description. And it does mention that it includes all improvements, fixtures, built-in appliances, and then list them, range, oven, refrigerator, so on, so forth. So nothing has to be placed in there. There is a section for other personal property. You'll want to watch out here if the MLS says that the washer and dryer stay with the property. You're going to want to place those in there because it's not pre-listed above. And of course, if there's anything that's going to be excluded. The purchase price, of course, the amount you're offering, because this is first written as an offer and signed by the buyer, and then when initialed and signed by the seller, becomes a fully executed contract. Initial deposit, rule of thumb, is 1%, and we do make it within left blank 3 days of the effective date. And in here, you're going to put the seller's chosen title company normally, and that should be listed on the MLS, which you would want to put in there. Next, we get down to any additional deposit, which you normally do not offer up in your offer. Sometimes it will come back as a counter offer where the sellers want additional money after a certain period of time, like inspections. Financing, normally we're going to express this as a percentage, 80% for conventional, 96.5% will go in there if it's FHA, and so on. Balance to close is this amount here. And of course, that doesn't include the prepaids, prorations, fees. Title company works out the exact amount due at closing. Time for acceptance, and you'll notice down the left side, we do have each line numbered. This is line 45. It's usually going to be 2 days. You're going to put in a date there, usually 2 days from the date that you place this offer. Closing date. Closing date finishes on page 2. And my note here is usually it's 30 to 45 days down the road. You're going to put a closing date. If it's a mortgage, you contact your lender and see how fast they can complete the file. And of course, cash should be a little bit sooner. And watch your dates. Make sure it's not a weekend or holiday, of course. At the bottom of each page, go the buyer's initial or initials initially. And then when it's initialed by the seller, you're fully executed. We go on to talk about extension of closing date. If the bank can't get the numbers to the buyer in time, you're supposed to get an extension. There's federal rules on that. Occupancy and possession. At closing, you turn over keys, garage door openers, and such. This box on line 72, item 6B, is marked if it is currently leased, and it goes on to explain that information has to be turned over to the buyer within 5 days after the fully executed contract. Assignability is normally going to be may not assign. If it's a mortgage, it can't be assigned or signed over to somebody else. Occasionally, you will see the first box marked may be assigned, but cannot be released from liability, and that would be if the prospective buyer puts the offer in their own name, but later wants to assign an LLC name to the property. It's quite common for investors to do that. And that would be this box, may assign but not be released from liability. Financing. If it's cash, 8A box is marked, there's no financing contingency. If it's B marked, if it's a mortgage, then there is quite a bit of verbiage here. You got to mark if it is a conventional, FHA, VA, or other mortgage. And it's contingent upon, within a certain amount of days, the buyer obtaining an approval from that mortgage lender. Normally, you're going to leave it blank for 30 days. You're going to mark what it is. Normally, it's fixed. It goes on to show that the buyer will make application within 5 days of the effective date. Talks about them making good faith and diligent effort to obtain the loan approval. Now, it does get quite detailed, and there's many provisions in there. Contact your broker for detailed questions on the mortgage section. Goes on to explain in item 9 closing costs to be paid by each party. Just makes sense. The seller is going to pay for their estoppel fee, which is the letter sent to title saying that they're caught up on their monthly dues. Example, and in the buyers, of course, are going to pay their appraisal, loan expenses, and such. So it's in the body of the contract. Title evidence, you normally leave that blank. 5 days prior to closing, title company is going to distribute the evidence of title and insurance. That's something title does. Next page, we're on to item line 168. Normally, seller shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's policy and charges, and the buyer will pay for their share of the title expenses. You could have the buyer designate and pay for everything, but that is extremely rare. And then there is the Miami-Dade provision if you are there. Talks about surveys, special assessments not pertaining to HOAs or condominium associations. And normally you're going to mark the box, seller shall pay installments due prior to closing and buyer after. Example of this would be a single family home, maybe semi-rural, where they just put in a sewer system and you have to pay for that on a monthly fee. Disclosures, this is the part of the contract where it simply explains terminology like radon gas and mold, lead-based paint. Of course, if the home is pre-78 construction, there is a required lead-based paint disclosure to be filled out and counter-initialed by the buyer. Real important, if anything is highlighted and all capitals, it's important. It simply states that if there is a HOA, there's supposed to be an HOA disclosure provided to the prospective buyer as an attachment in the MLS normally, that they should read and initial as they place the offer. Goes on to talk about property taxes. It is most likely going to change and go up when the buyer buys the property, so you can't go by what the current property owner is paying for taxes. FIRPTA simply talks about the possibility that the foreign owner of a property is going to owe money as fair play. In the United States, a resident has capital gains tax. A foreign person does not answer to the IRS, but there's most likely going to be a 15% holdback of their proceeds while all that is determined. Seller's disclosure, even though the seller's property disclosure is a separate form and not part of the contract, the seller is saying here that they're not hiding anything. Property maintenance explains that sellers to keep the property in good condition until closing when we're under contract. Inspection. Buyers shall have, and if left blank, it's 15 days after the effective date to have inspections done. Now, the smaller the number here, the stronger the offer, and I would say the average is 10 or 12 days. But you speak to your buyer about their needs and have a good property inspector handy to get it done as soon as possible. This walkthrough and inspections, top of the next page, line 275. The seller is signing that they're going to allow access for things like inspection and appraisal. They're going to assist in the closeout of building permits, but one important line in there says that they can't be forced to pay anything. They're supposed to cooperate and say what that permit is, see if it can be closed, but they do not have to pay any money to close it out. Assignment of repair and treatment contracts. Let's say it's a newer roof and there's a warranty. Seller must, at buyer's request, provide the information to transfer that. Now, if there's a cost, of course, the buyer pays it. The contract in line 13 goes into what the duties are of the escrow agent, i.e. the title company. Professional advice, broker liability. We try to limit broker liability, and the buyer relies solely on inspectors and tax records, public information to make their purchase, and they're not relying on the words of the agent. Again, more initials, bottom of page 6. Default and dispute resolution. We prefer things not to go to court, and there is a system in place for negotiations through a third party dispute resolution, court appointed mediators and such. Hopefully it never goes that far. Talks about title evidence, title examination, survey, ingress and egress. There's supposed to be a way to get into that property from the street. Lease information is to be given to the prospective buyer. Uh, Liens are to be found by the title company and taken care of. Time is of the essence of this contract. All days are counted, calendar days, all days, except that if a date, as an example for the earnest money deposit to be due or the end of the inspection period, falls on a weekend or a holiday, it automatically goes to the next day. It's in that verbiage, item F. Force majeure simply says, normally in Florida, if there's a hurricane, that this thing can be delayed without signatures, the closing, and since COVID, they've added mention of pandemics. Closing location does state that it should close in the county where the property is located, but can close any mutually agreed upon place. And of course, we now have mail closings with overnight delivery. Escrow closing procedure, again, instructions for title done through normally title company, can be an attorney. Prorations, credits, very important when it comes to taxes. Local taxing bodies do not split up the year. The owner of record at the time the bill goes out in November normally. So if the property is bought, let's say on June 30th, on paper at closing, the title company will take money from the seller's proceeds and credit to the buyer. Reason for that is the buyer is going to have that bill for the whole year, and that's not fair, except the money's being credited to them at closing. The next page, it goes over seller has to give access to the property for appraisals and inspections and walkthrough. Risk of loss, don't worry about memorizing this, but there is a provision. If there's something minor that happens between contract and closing, it's normally figured that insurance will take care of it and it'll be fixed. But if it's something more major, the buyer has the option of backing out or having money escrowed for the repairs based on what a contractor estimates. We go in to talk about some other legalese here. This line in R is small, but it's important. It gives power to addendums and riders. Simply, if there is an addendum changing the price after inspections or appraisal, this line gives that mutually signed and agreed upon addendum power over this contract. Talks about FIRPTA withholding tax there at the end again. We start page 11, continuing to talk about FIRPTA. Item 19. Now, if there's any of these items that are to be a part of the contract, for instance, if it's a condominium rider, the box is marked and it becomes part of the contract. And all those items clear through EE. Initials, of course. Additional terms, normally blank, but you can put additional terms in here. Maybe asking for seller concessions. Credit to the buyer at closing, a certain percentage or certain amount of dollars. And if you need exact wording on that, consult your broker. Now we're down to the signature page, initially signed and dated by a buyer. And if it's signed and dated by a seller, you have a fully executed contract. Congratulations, you go on towards closing. So that's our Florida FAR/BAR as is 13-page contract, the preferred contract for most agents to use in the state of Florida.